Ambassador Douglas Kmiec, what's your role here at Pepperdine University?
Well, I'm the Caruso Chair of Constitutional Law and Human Rights, and so I teach primarily the subjects related to our Constitution, but also the hopes and aspirations of the world communities as they manifest themselves through the various iterations of human rights. Most of my teaching, I have to say, has originated out of my frolics from the classroom. You know, I've been at the teaching business probably for 35 years or so at Notre Dame and here, and Dean at Catholic in Washington. And each time those experiences have been punctuated by other things. So I got to be Ronald Reagan's lawyer for a while on matters of the Constitution, and I brought that back into the classroom. And then President Obama gave me one of the greatest privileges of all time, and that is to be our country in a foreign country and to be ambassador to Malta. And so I've brought that back through the teaching of human rights.
How many presidents have you worked for?
Well, 3 if you count George H.W. Bush, and of course I do, but I really came to help Ronald Reagan in his second term. I joined the Justice Department in 1985, stayed through 1989, which allowed me to serve that first year of the senior Bush administration. And then in 2008, after an Easter Sunday epiphany, I endorsed Barack Obama, which he wasn't anticipating, and I wasn't anticipating either at the beginning of that campaign, because I began as a legal advisor to Mitt Romney and left that campaign only after he did, after his defeat in the primaries. But I was very distressed, I have to tell you, about the manner in which the candidates were treating each other, in particular the way in which Mr. Romney's religion had been handled. And that caused me to think more broadly, and one person that I discovered in my examination was kind of the ecumenical community spirit of Barack Obama, which resurrected, well, probably where I began life. I began life as a Democrat because my father was a coordinator for one John F. Kennedy. You may remember that that was a close election. Some people say it was a close election because of the vote in Cook County. And some people even say it was because of the cemetery vote in Cook County. And we used to ask Dad about that. And he had this little routine that he would do in response. He would get this troubled look on his face, and he'd say, "Well, son, if that were true, that only explains how there's life after death." And then, of course, under his breath, he would say, "If you were a Democrat." But I've been both in my life, and one of the things that I've tried to capture in this book, Lift Up Your Hearts, is a book that is about a life that begins in the story with the challenge to love your enemies, ends up tragically killing friends, and then explores the life that remains. So it's a bit of an autobiography that's blessed with extraordinary gifts of privileges to serve others, and at the same time enormous tragedy, totally unexpected, and working through that tragedy, and then out of that tragedy trying in the life that remains to build something even grander than we could have thought of at the beginning. You know, the central figures in terms of the book are a kindly old priest by the name of Monsignor John Sheridan, who to this day I can hear in my mind. After every morning Mass he would say, "Doug, how about a little tea and toast?" And of course, with that invitation, it was an invitation to explore the world in all of its dimensions from a spiritual side. And then a lovely little sister, Sister Mary Campbell, who was quite the opposite of John in terms of intellectual. John was the intellectual of intellectuals in terms of reading constantly. It was his breadth of knowledge of subjects was phenomenal. Mary took her spirit from the children around her and from the plants and flowers and so forth, and delighted John, just as being an Irish counterpart. But these two spiritual people are much in mind these days because we now have this new pontiff, Francis, who's just stunned the world. And how has he stunned the world? He stunned the world with humility. He said, let us change the world by embracing each other, not by excluding, but by loving one another. And that was John's methodology, to love your enemies. And when you think about that, that's really quite an ordeal to carry that off well, to actually love them, not just to tolerate them, not just to forgive them for an occasional slight, but to love them is a change in attitude that, is to discover something very important. And you discover that you're not the lead in your own life. You're not the lead character. And once you discover that, your heart is opened in a way for a real theology of kindness. And the two of us, John Sheridan and I, in the run-up to the election, when I endorsed Obama, we really stirred up a hornet's nest around here, unintentionally, because I was invited, among other things, as a conservative, to address how Catholics could possibly vote for Barack Obama. Can you imagine the temerity of that question? How could someone vote for Barack Obama? And I went to a Mass one evening, and I was the subject of the homily. And you know things are not going well if you're the subject of the homily, especially if it's a kind of fire and brimstone kind of homily. And but I was too thick to realize that something even more exclusionary was going to happen. I got in the communion line, and when I put out my hand for the communion, the priest just shook his head no, put his hand over the chalice. And I said, "I think you're making a mistake, Father." And he said, "No, you, sir, made the mistake in endorsing Barack Obama." And at that moment, I realized that love of enemy, if you could call a political opponent or a natural political opponent an enemy, was having a corrosive effect all the way down, right? From the top, we see the divisions where Congress can't meet fiscal deadlines, where they can't come together on almost any topic, where they start off well on immigration reform and they end up going nowhere. But it goes all the way down, and because it goes all the way down, it has to be addressed one soul at a time. And of course, here again comes Francis. And John Sheridan was sort of the emissary of Pope Francis, not in any formal sense. I'm certain they didn't know each other, but they would have loved each other. And the message would have been, you cannot think of people whose ideas differ from yours as an enemy. They are merely a challenge of honesty, a challenge of care and thoughtfulness, and you have to address them on the basis of their own dignity and ideas. That was John Sheridan's method, and of course, he was cheered by my support of Barack Obama, but I would say there are just legions of people who were looking for ways to get me to Gehenna faster, because of course the president was portrayed as an infant killer. He was portrayed in these most tragic terms. And here's where, if you close your heart and you close your mind, you never hear the other side. When Obama read my endorsement on Easter Sunday, he had his team call me and said, "Are you for real?" And I said, "Well, is your candidate for real?" And they said, "Well, come to Chicago, find out." And so a few weeks later I did. And it didn't take very long. I could see the genuineness of the Barack Obama that we now know existed as a young man working for the Campaign for Human Development in Chicago and trying to address the displacement of families very sincerely who had been displaced from the steel industries as things started to get outsourced and to get closed down, and we weren't able to keep up with retooling. Well, that same Barack Obama was the one who basically said to his fellow Democrats, don't draw artificial lines, don't count anybody out. Just because somebody's a person of faith doesn't mean that they can't be a Democrat. Indeed, as he pointed out to them, the language of faith in our history. And